Ah, come closer, kid. Sit by the fire and listen to an old story. It's an old one, but one that should never be forgotten. Amidst the shadows of great kings and blood-soaked battlefields, there was a peasant girl, yes, a peasant girl, who stepped forward to save an entire empire. Some called her crazy, others called her a blessed saint, but history never forgot her name. A long time ago, there was a horrible war that lasted for 100 years between France and England. The pride of kings, the ambitions of dynasties, and the indescribable suffering of the people. France was nearly on its knees. Its land was ravaged and the people had lost hope. As enemy cities were falling one by one, in a forgotten little village on the edge, a girl was growing up who would change the course of destiny. She was Joan of Arc. This is her story. A shepherd's daughter who became a warrior, took on a divine mission to save France, and in the end, fell victim to the ruthless grip of betrayal. But remember, kid, history is not only about kings and commanders, it's also about the real heroes that rise from the people. And now it's time to tell that story. So lean back and listen closely. Let's dive into the chain of events that shaped Joan of Arc's destiny. Now listen closely, my child, because the story I'm about to tell is more than just a simple war. It's the story of the 100 Years' War, which shaped the fate of Europe for a century, shook kingdoms, devastated populations, and caused unimaginable suffering. Close your eyes and imagine this. It's the early 14th century, in the heart of Europe, on the fertile lands of France, the seeds of a great war being sown. England and France can no longer hide their centuries-old ambitions. Royal rivalries, betrayals, and bloodshed. Oh, so much blood was spilled for this cause. It all began when King Edward III of England claimed his right to the French throne. The Valois dynasty, which ruled France at the time, rejected this claim completely. But the English were too determined to back down. The war, which started in 1337, would last for generations, ravage France's fertile lands, and extinguish the people's hopes. But you must understand, child, this wasn't just a fight for the throne. This was a time when the feudal system was beginning to crack, when lords and kings were starting to lose their absolute authority over the people. Europe, shaken by famine, plague, and uprisings, was no longer the Europe it once was. And France, oh, poor France. Once the magnificent empire that ruled over all of Europe, now trampled under the feet of the English. Fear ruled the streets of Paris and Orléans. The people were impoverished. King Charles VII trembled in fear of losing his throne. And in this dark time, a miraculous voice rose up. That voice belonged to a peasant girl who would change the course of history. In the harsh winter of 1412, a baby was born in the small and modest village of Domremy in northern France. Her name was Jeanne. Who could have known that this delicate baby would one day become the hope of France? Jeanne was born to an ordinary family. Her father, Jacques d'Arche, was a simple farmer, and her mother, Isabelle, was known for her deep religious faith. Though Domremy was under the shadow of war, the villagers knew how to make do with what they had. But remember, Jacques, the spirit of the times never favored peace. The dark clouds of war were always hovering over this village as well. As a child, Jeanne worked in the fields, tended the sheep and prayed. But she was no ordinary child. From a young age, she felt that a destiny was written for her, one that would change the future of France. Her faith was deep, and in her heart she believed she had a holy mission. It is said that when Jeanne was just 13 years old, she began to hear sacred voices for the first time. Ah, child, sometimes the greatest stories in history begin in the most unlikely ways. Jeanne claimed that these voices told her she was destined to save France. The saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, guided her, telling her that God had chosen her for a special mission and that she must go on a journey to rescue France. What a strange fate, isn't it, child? A peasant girl, not the daughter of a lord, not the daughter of a knight, just an ordinary, simple child of the people. And yet, one day, she would change the fate of a vast kingdom. But who would believe her? Who would think that a young girl could win battles on the field of war? But fate is an unpredictable game, and Jeanne was beginning to write that fate with her own hands. Child, some people are born to live an ordinary life, while others are born to walk the tough roads of destiny. And Jeanne d'Arc was the second kind. She wasn't just a farmer's daughter. She was chosen by God, or at least that's what she believed. Now close your eyes and imagine those days. It was 1425. Jeanne was only 13 years old. One day, while tending sheep in the lush fields of Domremy, a sudden bright light appeared. This light wasn't just ordinary sunlight, it was a divine sign from the heavens. And then, voices. Yes, voices. But these weren't just the product of a girl's imagination. According to Jeanne, these voices were coming straight from heaven. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These three holy figures called to her. At first, the voices merely told her to live a virtuous life, to go to church, and to keep her faith strong. But over time, the messages grew clearer and more urgent. And one day, Jeanne heard the words that would change her life forever. Get up, Jeanne, save France. Save France? How could this be possible? She was just a peasant girl from Domremy. She had no army, no royal lineage, but she had faith. Child, remember this. Throughout history, the greatest warriors haven't been those with the sharpest swords, but those with the strongest faith. And Jeanne's faith was stronger than steel. The divine voices continued to guide her. They told her to go to King Charles VII, the rightful heir to the French throne, to take him to Reims for his coronation and to fight against the English oppression. That day, Jeanne understood her destiny, and from that moment on, she knew she could never live an ordinary life. But great destinies begin with great trials. Child, the road to a king's palace is paved with stones, and most who walk it stumble at the very first step. But Jeanne d'Arc wasn't ordinary. She was determined to walk that difficult road. She knew her fate, but to fulfill her holy mission, she needed an army. So who would believe in her? Who would believe that a young girl claiming to have divine messages could promise to save France? At first she needed support, so in 1428, she left her family and village behind and set out for Vaucouleurs. Vaucouleurs was a small but strategically important fortress in eastern France, and it was home to a commander named Robert de Baudricourt, who was loyal to King Charles VII. When Jeanne arrived at Vaucouleurs, she went straight to the commander and told him her story, her divine visions, the fate of France, the mission she had to fulfill to defeat the English. But Baudricourt laughed. A peasant girl, she's going to lead an army? She's going to meet the king? Get out of here. Baudricourt didn't take Jeanne seriously, but Jeanne didn't give up. Inside her, there was a fire that others couldn't see. Days passed, weeks passed, and soon rumors of Jeanne's prophecies began to spread. Because this young girl wasn't just talking, she was giving astonishing details about France's fate. And then a miracle happened. Jeanne turned to Baudricourt and said, "You know, sir, Orléans is under siege. But don't worry, if I go to the king, Orléans will be saved, and France will rise again." Baudricourt ignored these words. But a few weeks later, news arrived. Orléans had indeed been besieged. How could Jeanne have known this? At that moment, Baudricourt realized that this young girl was not just a dreamer. Maybe, just maybe, she was truly sent by God. Finally, Jeanne was given a few soldiers and permission to go to Chinon, where King Charles VII was. But remember, child, this was just the beginning. Kings don't just meet with anyone. and Charles VII wouldn't immediately accept this peasant girl. But Jeanne was determined. When she arrived at Chinon Castle, she didn't just face a king. She faced a man who was about to confront his own destiny. King Charles VII, living in constant fear of losing his throne, didn't yet know what kind of hope this peasant girl could bring him. But he would soon learn. And here, my child, is where Jeanne's legend truly began. Child, history is full of great wars. But some wars aren't fought just to gain land. Some wars decide the fate of nations. The siege of Orléans was one of those wars. And in this battle, we would see how a peasant girl could rally an entire nation. It was the fall of 1428. The 100 Years' War was ravaging France. The English and their Burgundian allies had been gradually taking over French lands for years. The country was bleeding like an open wound. And now, a dagger was about to be driven into the heart of France. The siege of Orléans had begun. Orléans wasn't just a city for France. It was a strategically vital point. If the English took it, it would break France's resistance, and the path to the throne for King Charles VII would be completely shut. But the French army was in disarray. The soldiers were hungry, tired, and demoralized. After months of war, they had lost hope. Even King Charles VII's commanders were desperate. No one believed they could save Orléans. The English, on the other hand, were incredibly confident. For them, Orléans was like a fruit hanging on the vine, ready to fall. They had captured the nearby castles and controlled the river. They knew the French morale had collapsed and believed that if they just waited a little longer, Orléans would surrender. But sometimes, history is written by the most unexpected hand. And this time, the pen of fate was in the hands of a young girl. Child, an army isn't only made strong by swords, armor, and horses. True strength comes from the fire burning in the hearts of the soldiers. And Jeanne d'Arc became a spark that arose from the ashes of the French army. In April of 1429, Jeanne set out to save Orléans. She carried a sacred banner, and behind her was an army that had started to believe in her. After meeting with the king, she was given armor and a small unit. But her greatest weapon was her unshakable faith in God. At first, the French believed Jeanne was just a prophet, not a warrior. But Jeanne was not just someone who spoke. She was a leader on the battlefield. When she arrived in Orléans, she spoke directly with the soldiers, giving them courage and calming their fears. The soldiers saw a light in her eyes, the light of reborn hope. And then, the battle began. Jeanne went straight to the battlefield. She wasn't a commander, she had no formal military training, but she wasn't afraid of the enemy. She took charge of the French army and led them forward. One by one, she targeted the castles the English had seized. At first, the French commanders were stunned by her courage. But soon they realized that Jeanne was not only an inspiration, she had the spirit of a true warrior. During one of the most critical moments of the battle, Jeanne was severely wounded. An arrow struck her shoulder. The soldiers panicked because her fall was seen as a sign that the sacred girl had been struck down by God. But child, a true hero is not defined by when they fall, but by when they rise again. Jeanne, bloodied and on the ground, quickly got back up. Her wound was bandaged and she returned to the battlefield. Her return spread like wildfire among the French soldiers. Their morale soared and their courage was restored. And at that moment, the tide of the battle turned. Under Jeanne's leadership, the French launched a counterattack. The English were forced to retreat. After days of fighting, the English army at Orléans was scattered. The siege was broken. Child, there are moments in history that don't just change the fate of a city, but the fate of an entire nation. The siege of Orléans was one of those moments. Jeanne didn't just bring France a victory, she brought back hope. Now the French people knew that the English were not invincible. And Jeanne d'Arc was no longer just a girl on a holy mission, she was remembered as a war hero. But this was only the beginning, because Jeanne's path would lead her directly to even greater battles that would determine the future of France. Child, to achieve victory on the battlefield, one does not only need strong swords and heavy armor. What truly leads an army to triumph is courage and faith. But to ignite these, a spark is needed, a leader. And Jeanne d'Arc was exactly that leader. What set her apart wasn't just her presence on the battlefield. She was the inspiration that shaped the spirit of her army. In a man's world, it was unthinkable for a young girl to step up in front of soldiers and command them. But remember, child, heroes sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places. Jeanne d'Arc was one such leader, one who held her sword by the will of God, and who lifted her army with her courage. Many people saw Jeanne merely as a source of inspiration. But the truth is, she was a commander. Despite having no formal military training, she possessed an intuitive military genius. Her battle tactics were unlike the typical medieval strategies. The greatest problem of the French armies at that time was their disarray and demoralization, especially when compared to the English. Jeanne's first step was to unite the troops under one common goal: to save France by the will of God. But faith alone wasn't enough. On the battlefield, quick decisions had to be made, and the enemy's weak points had to be identified. Jeanne adopted an offensive strategy. The French were traditionally a nation that fought using heavily armored cavalry and prolonged sieges. However, Jeanne realized the power of speed and sudden attacks. As she demonstrated in Orléans, her philosophy was to catch the enemy off guard, move quickly, and strike at unexpected moments. The English preferred protracted war of attrition battles. Jeanne, on the other hand, moved like lightning. She would suddenly attack a castle, surprise the enemy, and force them to retreat. But we do not judge a leader only by their battle strategy. We judge them by their courage. Jeanne fought in the front lines of every battle. She wasn't like a king who stayed behind and gave orders. She fought with her own sword, leading her soldiers. Her troops were in awe of her courage. Normally, commanders, especially nobles, would issue orders from the safest parts of the battlefield. But Jeanne was right there where death loomed. Many soldiers believed she wasn't an ordinary human being. Some saw her as God's messenger, others as a holy warrior. Regardless, they were determined to follow her. Child, war isn't just a place where swords and arrows speak. Their spirits, wills, and beliefs clash. And Jeanne's greatest strength was her ability to touch the hearts of her soldiers. The soldiers who fought alongside her didn't think they were just following an ordinary commander. They believed they were following a leader chosen for a holy mission. Her words soothed their fears and gave them courage. At that time, one of the greatest problems for any army was discipline. Soldiers would often resort to looting or flee when tired of the war, but such behavior was impossible in Jeanne's army. She instilled a moral discipline. She forbade any harm to churches, prevented mistreatment of civilians, and most importantly, made her soldiers feel that they were not just mercenaries, but servants of a holy cause. Even her mere presence on the battlefield made the French soldiers stronger. Her fighting at the front lines inspired them. She stood tall, even in the most intense moments of fear. That's why her soldiers showed their loyalty not only with obedience, but with their hearts. So much so that when she was severely wounded during a battle, her soldiers wouldn't even let her fall. They immediately helped her up and took her back into the fight. For them, Jeanne wasn't just a commander, she was the embodiment of victory. Through her battlefield successes, Jeanne d'Arc became not just a military leader, but a legend. Thanks to her leadership, the French army, for the first time, gained a true superiority over the English. But, child, the fate of great heroes is not always written in victories. History has seen not only triumphs, but also betrayals. Jeanne's path would lead her to greater battles, greater victories, and ultimately to an inevitable end. But before reaching that end, Jeanne d'Arc would march to Reims, capturing the heart of France. child, great battles are not won solely by the clash of swords and arrows. Some victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of people. Jeanne d'Arc's greatest struggle was perhaps this: fighting not only the enemy, but also the doubts, hesitations, and the despair of the people. The victory at Orléans had given the French people a glimmer of hope, but that hope needed to become a lasting victory. And for that to happen, one task remained. France's true king had to claim his rightful place. The legitimacy of France was in jeopardy. The English and their allies, the Burgundians, were trying to place their own candidates on the French throne. However, for a true king to ascend, he needed to be consecrated in the ancient tradition of France, at Reims. And this child would be Jeanne d'Arc's next great triumph, leading the march to Reims to fulfill this sacred mission. After the victory at Orléans, Jeanne and the French army set their sights on a greater goal, Reims. But this journey wasn't just a military campaign. It was the march of faith, destiny, and the rebirth of France's spirit. Reims was the heart of French monarchy. For centuries, French kings had been consecrated there, and only after this sacred ceremony could they truly be recognized as kings. But the English and their Burgundian allies controlled the roads to Reims. Most of the cities along the way were either in the hands of the enemy or loyal to them. It was at this moment that Jeanne's leadership and spiritual strength shone once again. She made it clear to Charles VII that they could not win through battle alone. They needed to win the hearts of the people. There was another weapon as powerful as the sword: faith. Under Jeanne's influence, the French people believed this journey wasn't merely a military campaign, but a holy mission. The army advanced northward along the Loire River. There were many cities along the way. Some refused to surrender, others hesitated. But Jeanne's presence inspired many cities to join the French cause. Key cities like Troyes, Chalon, and Reims surrendered without much resistance. This showed that Jeanne was not just a warrior, but a leader of the people. As her name spread, more and more people began to believe that God had sent her to save France. As the cities opened their gates to the French army, the doubts inside Charles VII began to fade. From the beginning, the king had not fully believed in Jeanne's mission, but the victories at Orléans and the march toward Reims opened his eyes. The people believed in Jeanne, and a king's greatest power comes from the faith of his people. Finally, on July 17, 1429, the gates of Reims opened. Charles VII and his army entered the city without encountering any resistance. The Reims Cathedral hosted a magnificent ceremony that day. In keeping with the ancient traditions of French monarchy, Charles was consecrated and officially declared the King of France. Jeanne d'Arc stood in the front row during the coronation. Child, sometimes history's greatest moments are not found in the midst of battle, but in the quiet of a cathedral. In that moment, one could see both the light of victory and a sense of melancholy in Jeanne's eyes. For her, this battle wasn't just about gaining territory. It was about rekindling the spirit of France. When France's true king was consecrated before God, Jeanne d'Arc's greatest triumph had been achieved. But child, what happens after a victory is just as important as the victory itself. For Jeanne, this marked a turning point. She was no longer just a warrior, she was a savior. Yet, the fate of great heroes is often shaped by great tragedies. And Jeanne's journey was far from over. He and his family after the war went to the Soviet Union, where perhaps the Hurt family's childhood had been the most difficult and most challenging of all. Now she faced her greatest trials yet. Child, throughout history, the greatest trials of great heroes are not always fought on the battlefield, but in the dark corridors of palaces. A hero of the people can defeat enemy armies, but if they are left alone in the shadows of courtly intrigue, even their brightest victories can become meaningless. And this is where Jeanne d'Arc found herself at a crossroads. With Charles VI's coronation in Reims, a new era had begun for France. However, every new beginning is met with the discontent of those who cling to the old order. Jeanne d'Arc's rise had sparked unrest not only among the English and Burgundians, but also within the French nobility. For Jeanne was not of noble birth. She was neither the daughter of a duke nor the heir to a count. She was a peasant girl from the village of Domremy, and the nobility saw her rise as a threat. Jeanne d'Arc had won on the battlefield with her sword, but to win in the palace, different weapons were required. King Charles VII, now fully aware of his responsibilities as monarch, began to fall under the influence of his court. The royal advisors felt that Jeanne's influence over the people had grown too strong. Her claim that she acted on divine visions made the clergy uneasy. Her ability to win the people's affection stirred the jealousy of the nobles. Those who had once trusted her now began to consider ways to rid themselves of her. The greatest blow came from the king himself. When Jeanne had stood by his side during the coronation in Reims, she had been his protector. But over time, the king's trust in her began to wane. Her name was still seen as a threat by the English and Burgundians, but within the French court, she was now considered a burden. There were increasing calls for Jeanne to step down, as her mission was seen as complete. But Jeanne was not someone who knew how to retreat. She still sought to liberate France completely. She wanted to raise an army to reclaim Paris from the English, but Charles VII refused to support her. Now, Jeanne had to fight not only her enemies on the battlefield, but also the growing doubt among her own people. And it was here that her greatest tragedy began. Child, the fall of a hero is not always sudden. It comes step by step, slowly. And by the time they realize it, it is already too late. For Jeanne d'Arc, the beginning of the end was written at Compiègne. By late 1429, Jeanne was losing the king's support, yet she remained determined to fight. The English and Burgundians still controlled much of northern France. Without the king's order, Jeanne continued to fight to push them back. She had an inner fire, and she had no intention of stopping until the task God had given her was fulfilled. But this time, fate did not work in her favor. In May 1430, Jeanne entered the city of Compiègne, which was under siege by the Burgundians. She intended to defend the city and support the French forces, but the battlefield betrayed her this time. The Burgundians attacked with a powerful army, and Jeanne and her men had ventured out to defend the city. But things didn't go as planned. The French forces had to retreat, and as the city gates closed, Jeanne was left outside. In just a few seconds, everything changed. The soldiers who had fought beside her were retreating, but Jeanne did not step back for even a moment. Yet now she was alone. The Burgundian soldiers surrounded her. She still held her sword, but this time she could not continue the fight. They knocked her from her horse and brought her to the ground. Jeanne d'Arc was not defeated that day on the battlefield. What defeated her was the abandonment by her own people. The Burgundians saw Jeanne as a prize. They didn't kill her because her value alive was far greater than in death. They knew they could sell her to the English. Everything Jeanne had done for her people seemed to be forgotten in an instant. The kingdom did nothing to save her, and finally, by the end of 1430, Jeanne d'Arc was handed over to the English. She had freed French lands from the English, but her own people would not save her. From here, the greatest trial of heroes would unfold. Justice, which is often a weapon in the hands of the powerful. And Jeanne's fate would no longer be written on the battlefield, but in a courtroom. Child, throughout history, many battles have been fought, many kingdoms have been established. Countless rulers have come and gone, but justice has always been a weapon in the hands of the powerful. This was one of the greatest truths that determined Jeanne d'Arc's fate. The young woman who had saved France with her sword would now have to fight for her life not with weapons but with words, in a court where justice was a battle already lost from the start. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, for here you will see how a people's hero was silenced, how her faith was tested, and how her destiny was sealed. After Jeanne d'Arc was captured by the Burgundians, she was sold to the English. To them, she was not just a prisoner of war, she was a source of French morale. a sacred figure. Killing her would have been easy, but if she were condemned in a court, she would be remembered not as a saint, but as a traitor in the eyes of the people. In early 1431, Jeanne was brought to Rouen, a city under English control. For her, it would be both a prison and the site of her final battle. The man overseeing the trial was Bishop Pierre Cochon, an English sympathizer. The goal of the trial was clear: to force Jeanne to deny the divine messages she claimed to have received, or to label her as a sorceress and heretic. The trial, according to the Church's rules, was supposed to appear fair, but nothing about it was just. Jeanne had no defense. She faced a barrage of churchmen and legal experts. The English had gathered the sharpest and most ruthless minds to interrogate her. For days and weeks, they questioned her, using every word against her, hoping she would slip up. But Jeanne d'Arc was no ordinary person. Just as she had been fearless on the battlefield, here she remained unshaken. Child, some people are born warriors. Some fight with swords, others with words. Jeanne d'Arc was a warrior who fought with words in that courtroom. They wanted her to deny her divine visions. They asked if Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret really spoke to her. "Did God truly speak to you?" they asked. But Jeanne never faltered. "God guided me," she said, "and I am only fulfilling his commands." They forced her to dress as a woman, accusing her of dressing in men's clothing. They knew that a woman in battle would be vulnerable in a dress, but they used this as a means to humiliate her. They threatened to torture her, but she did not abandon her faith. At night, she was chained in her cell. She was not allowed to sleep. Her food was rationed. They sought to break her will, but every morning she rose stronger. To their questions, she answered with the wisdom of a sage. No matter how much they pressured her, no matter how much they tried to deceive her, she remained true to her beliefs. But child, the strong do not always win. The truth is not always heard. And Jeanne d'Arc's fate had already been sealed. She was accused of being a false prophet, a witch, and a heretic. To claim she had received messages from God was a crime in their eyes. Yet, the voice of God echoed deeply in her soul. But the court did not wish to hear it. They wanted to silence her, and they would. Jeanne d'Arc was found guilty. She had two choices before her. Either she would reject her visions and spend the rest of her life in prison, or she would be condemned to death for standing firm in her beliefs. That day, she had to make the most difficult decision of her life. And so the young girl who had once led armies and guided kings was now a prisoner in a courtroom, fighting for her life. But the outcome of this battle had already been decided. Jeanne's greatest trial was now upon her. Death was knocking at her door. Child, some people do not die on the battlefield. They perish in the darkened courtrooms of history, falsely accused, falling victim to the most brutal hands of oppression. And unfortunately, Jeanne d'Arc was destined to meet such an end. It was May of 1431. As the sun rose over Rouen, no one thought that it would be a day like any other. That morning, the streets were filled with people. French peasants, English soldiers, and churchmen alike, all heading toward the Vieux Marché Square. Because that day, a young girl who claimed to be God's servant would be burned at the stake, accused of heresy. Jeanne d'Arc had been declared guilty by the court. She was branded as a heretic, sorceress, and a woman who defied the church. Yet all she had done was bring hope to her people and restore France's freedom. But the powerful feared her. The only way to silence her was through death. When they brought Jeanne out of her prison cell that morning, she was weary but not afraid. She was chained, her clothes were filthy, but her eyes still held the unwavering belief of a warrior. When a bishop demanded that she kneel and beg for forgiveness one last time, Jeanne responded with her head held high. "You may kill me, but you could never silence the messages that God gave me." These words sent a chill through everyone present. Even the English soldiers hesitated for a moment, for they did not face someone who had surrendered to fear, but a woman who remained true to her faith until the very end. When she was brought to the execution site, a large pile of wood had been prepared. As she was tied to the wooden stake, the crowd fell silent. No one wanted to witness this moment, but everyone's eyes were there. Jeanne d'Arc lifted her head to the sky and began to pray to God. As the fire slowly engulfed the wood, tears rose from the crowd. The French whispered, "She is a saint," but the English wanted her to die as a traitor. As the fire reached Jeanne's body, she cried out one last time, "Oh, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." And so, at the age of 19, a young woman, once a warrior, a leader, a symbol of faith, disappeared into the smoke. Those who watched her turn to ashes did not realize they were witnessing the birth of a legend. Jeanne d'Arc's body was burned, her ashes scattered into the Seine River, but her name was forever etched into history, impossible to erase. Child, the death of great people may destroy their bodies, but their ideas, beliefs, and legacies continue to live on. Jeanne d'Arc's death caused a stir throughout France and all of Europe. The French people began to honor her as a hero. The English, however, wanted her name to be forgotten. But history did not forget Jeanne. In the square where she was burned, people whispered, believing in her innocence. Over time, thoughts of her as a saint began to grow stronger, and in France, her death became the spark that ended the war. For Jeanne was no longer a woman, but a symbol, child. Sometimes death is not an end, but a beginning. Jeanne d'Arc's burning seemed like a catastrophe for France, but in reality, it ignited the flames of French resistance. The English believed her death would strike fear into the French, but they were wrong. When Jeanne died, France was still under English control, but her cause lived on in the hearts of the people. Jeanne had crowned Charles VII, and now the king owed her a debt. The English's hold on France began to slowly erode. The French people continued to carry on Jeanne's legacy. Her spirit began to live on in every French soldier's heart. The people rebelled, and one by one, cities returned to French hands. The war that Jeanne had started during her life became even stronger after her death. And years later, in 1453, the 100 Years' War finally came to an end. The English lost the territories they had long occupied. The French army, inspired by Jeanne's legacy, continued to fight and eventually succeeded in driving the English completely out of French soil. By 1453, the 100 Years' War had officially ended, and Jeanne d'Arc's name became synonymous with France's freedom. She was no longer just a soldier, but the savior of France, the soul of the nation. Child, history is full of great battles and mighty kingdoms, but sometimes one person can be as powerful as an entire army. Jeanne d'Arc was not just a soldier, she was a belief. She became a symbol for those who resist fate, for those who stand against injustice, for those who fight for freedom. And even today, her story is told. There are squares and churches named after her. Her spirit still wanders the streets of France. Even 500 years later, they have not forgotten her. Because some people do not die, child. They become legends. Child, sometimes the destinies of people are reshaped in the light of retroactive justice. Jeanne d'Arc's life and death can never be understood from a single perspective. Her story is a challenge to the injustices and misunderstandings of time. But her impact was so deep and powerful that with every passing year, those searching for the truth have opened the dark pages of her history once more. And so in the year 1456, after the grace of God and the resistance of the people, Jeanne d'Arc's name would emerge from the shadowy court records and bask in the sunlight once again. This retrial process would become a symbol of national victory, beyond simple justice. Exactly 25 years after her death, her story came alive once more. The woman who the French saw as their savior and the English labeled as a heretic had left deep scars in the hearts of both sides. She was a lost hope, a lost victory. But time is the greatest teacher, and it ensures everything finds its rightful place. After Jeanne's death, the French government, now strengthened, accepted that what had been done to her was unjust. The grandeur of the kingdom had returned, but the dark shadows of the past still lingered in the hearts of the people. Therefore, Pope Calixtus III ordered a trial to examine the case of Jeanne d'Arc. The papacy would reconsider the decisions made regarding Jeanne's death and take the necessary steps to absolve her. This trial was not merely to prove the innocence of one woman, but also to mark a historical moment that would reshape the national identity of France. In 1456, this judicial process began. Finally, the papacy concluded that Jeanne d'Arc was innocent and that her death had been unjust. She was a messenger sent by God, a saint. Jeanne's legacy was now sanctified not only in the eyes of the people, but also by the very truths recognized by the papacy. Jeanne d'Arc's official exoneration was a victory for France's soul, a moment of rebirth. This was not just the acceptance of one woman's innocence, but the resurrection of the nation itself. The court that had judged her was officially recognized by the French as having been in error. However, this was just the beginning. After Jeanne's exoneration, the French did not merely view her as a hero. They began to elevate her as God's messenger, the spirit of France. Over time, her name would be raised to the level of sainthood. In 1920, Pope Benedict the King declared Jeanne a saint, declared that Jeanne's life was a saint of Saumur and a saint. Though the pain and battles she endured during her life had eventually been eased, the process of declaring her a saint was, in itself, a true story of sanctity. She would be remembered not only as a figure who shook France, but as one who inspired all civilizations. Saint Jeanne d'Arc became a symbolic figure not only for the freedom of France, but also for the fight for gender equality. Child, though people may die, the legacies they leave behind often live on more powerfully than death itself. Jeanne d'Arc has become an important figure not only in the construction of French national identity, but also in demonstrating the power of the human spirit to the entire world. Her legacy is, in truth, all of our story. Is she a hero or a saint? Jeanne d'Arc has become a symbol for those who fight for freedom, not just for France, but for the entire world. For the French, she is not just a warrior, but one of the cornerstones of their national identity. Her struggle was not just the effort of one nation, but a symbol of an entire people rewriting their destiny. Jeanne became a symbol that made the French people realize the strength within themselves. Even today in France, there are many squares, statues, and monuments dedicated to her. Every year, on the anniversary of her death in May, the French hold ceremonies to honor her courage and determination. In these ceremonies, Jeanne's heroism serves as an inspiration not just for the French, but for all those who fight for freedom around the world. Because Jeanne d'Arc's story is not only about the victory of one nation, but the struggle for justice and equality for all humanity. Jeanne d'Arc has not only been a military leader throughout history, but also an icon in art and culture. Her name appears in countless works, from literature to theater, paintings to films. Her story has been woven into literature throughout the ages. Mark Twain's Joan of Arc recounts Jeanne's youth and her heroic journey, and similar themes are explored in the works of Shakespeare. Victor Hugo's La Pucelle is an important source for telling Jeanne's legend. And of course, Jeanne's name has a significant place in cinema as well. Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1928 silent film The Passion of Joan of Arc delves deeply into Jeanne's trial and her journey toward death. This film is considered one of the greatest masterpieces in cinema history, Finally, Jeanne d'Arc's legacy has a powerful presence in popular culture. Today, her name is used in various areas from football clubs to music bands. She's not just a historical figure, but a cultural symbol that has transcended generations. Child, this is Jeanne d'Arc's true legacy, a hero who, in her journey, delivered messages of equality, justice, and freedom to all humanity. Her name will continue to be remembered, not only in France, but throughout the world. And one day, the woman they said had died may be reborn as a different hero for each generation. Child, history flows like a great river. Many names, pages, and stories blend into its waters. Yet sometimes, a single drop falling into this river can alter its entire course and impact the world. Jeanne d'Arc is one of those drops. She was a woman, but within her soul there was the strength of a nation. Today, her name is engraved in the pages of history, remembered as one of the greatest heroes not only of the French, but of all humanity. Jeanne's life is a saga, woven not just with victories, heroism, and the salvation of a nation, but also with pain, injustice, and sacrifice. Her journey began at a young age, marked by divine visions, leading her to become a figure known not only in France, but across the world. Born a peasant girl, her courage and determination made her a leader of a nation. From the siege of Orléans to the journey to Reims, every step she took was shaped by her military genius and divine inspiration. On the battlefield, she uplifted the morale of her troops and instilled hope in the hearts of the French people. But these victories showed that she was not just a soldier, but a leader of extraordinary character. Jeanne d'Arc became immortal for France, but she was also a symbol for the entire world, a symbol of justice, determination, and freedom. However, the greatest heroes of history often do not receive the recognition they deserve in their time. Jeanne was no different. Her greatness was only fully understood years after her death, when justice was finally served. But the arrival of that moment was a symbol of the people's resistance, the nation's reckoning, and above all, the pursuit of truth. Child, the true power of a hero is measured over time. Jeanne d'Arc's legacy continues to live on, not just in France, but around the world. She is remembered not only as a military leader, but also as the bearer of the spirit of her people. Today, her name is respected worldwide. Many people learn her story, admire her determination, courage, and loyalty. Jeanne d'Arc's life is a significant lesson, not only for the French, but for all of humanity throughout history. In France, every year, on the anniversary of her death in May, ceremonies are held to honor her. She is not only a warrior, but also the symbol of her people's fight for freedom. Monuments, statues, poems, and songs are there to preserve her life and struggle for eternity. Jeanne d'Arc's story has transcended time. She did not just overcome the obstacles a woman faced in her lifetime. She inspired her people, her nation, and all those who believed in her. Today she has become a symbol of women's rights movements and a struggle for freedom worldwide. Jeanne is not just an inspiration for the French, but for all of humanity. The young girl who dedicated herself to God now stands as the representative of all those who seek justice and equality. This woman, who dedicated herself to the salvation of a nation, is now the hero of all women and all freedom seekers. Child, thus, we have opened a window to Jeanne d'Arc's story. Her life bears the marks of an extraordinary journey made by an ordinary woman in an ordinary time. A peasant girl endowed with the power of God left her indelible mark on history. Her victory, heroism, resistance, and symbol of freedom continue to inspire. She became a guide for both France and humanity. Now, her story serves as an inspiration for much more. Regardless of our nationality, language, or background, Jeanne d'Arc's legacy still calls to us. We remember how a woman shaped this world with the power of courage, determination, and faith. Remember, child, a person, a hero, a saint can possess the power to transcend time and place. Jeanne d'Arc's story is the finest example of this. She will continue to live, not just in history books, but in our hearts. because true heroes never disappear.